or the PowerPoint slides, so that this video will keep running. I'll be like in an insert up in the corner of your screen. I may sort of adjust it back and forth a little bit while I chat. One of the things you may notice, I'm sitting in front of a virtual background. I actually do have a green screen behind me here, and when I move my hands, you might notice there's a little bit of green around there along the way. So I can put myself anywhere in the world. And right now I'm in the place that you might recognize if you've seen the movie Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. This is a place called Petra. And this is a city that has elements of it actually carved into the natural surroundings, like the mountain here. So I invite you to go on Google and find Petra. It doesn't feature too much in the New Testament, but it has an old worldly feel to it. So one of the things we see when we're looking at different elements in the New Testament, we're looking for cultural artifacts, and we're looking for things that fit the world in which it is. So one of the things I hope that we'll discover as we go through the class, not just this week, but in future weeks, is a little bit more about what's going on. I'm going to try to remember that my camera is actually up here. So if I seem to be looking down rather than looking directly in your eyes, it's because I sort of have to look up to see you, and so forgive me if I don't seem to be looking directly at you, because my vision sort of gravitates to the image that I'm seeing and not necessarily to the camera, and that's one of the weirdnesses of Zoom. But I am making the Zoom presentation for you. The first thing I thought I would do is go over the part that we went into in terms of interpreting the Bible, and I'll repeat some of the information that I did there, and hopefully have a few extra things. But I'm going to try to sort of share my screen here, and let's see, I will share this presentation here. So let's see if you are seeing the screen. I hope you are seeing the screen, and I'm going to go to slideshow. Different concepts for interpreting the Bible. When I was in seminary, we had to memorize these terms that we're going to be talking about here, and we had to apply them in different ways. But to a large extent, they're actually pretty simple. The first word here, called exegesis, essentially means we're looking at the Bible, we're looking at different passages, we're looking at stories, we're looking at parables, we're looking at verses. And one of the things that we're trying to do when we do that is we're trying to figure out what it means, not just to us, but what it meant when it was written down, what it meant when it was being told. A lot of the things in the Bible, especially in the Gospels, were originally oral stories that were traded from person to person. They weren't necessarily written down first. There are a couple of exceptions to that. For example, the Gospel of Luke and Acts as a set piece were originally written down, but they were incorporating into those stories that had been passed on from person to person. But if we take a biblical passage out of context, if we just sort of lift it up and say, aha, look and see what this says, we often miss what's happening there. And one of my favorite examples of that is from a guy named Hal Lindsey. And Hal Lindsey, I mentioned before, wrote a book called The Late Great Planet Earth, and he was trying to fit the end time prophecies with the middle of the 20th century. And he came to the conclusion that the world was most likely going to end. If you remember, as I remember, I'm old enough to remember when this was first run, he didn't use the word probably very often. He was pretty definite that the world was going to end in 1988. And he only later backed off of that claim when, of course, the world didn't end back then. But he took a passage out of the Bible that said, "This generation shall not pass away until all of these things take place." And he read that this generation as being his generation. But of course, the people who wrote that first were writing it 1900 years earlier. What did they mean by this generation? Were they really in the year 100 or in the year 150 or whenever that actually got written down? actually looking forward 1900 years to a guy on television named Hal Lindsey and saying, this is obviously what we meant. That's an example of eisegesis. That's taking a passage and putting your own assumptions into it. If you do exegesis, you sort of look at what's going on around that passage. And we know that that passage about this generation is really talking to the person who's reading it right then and there when it's being written. Because, of course, one of the things that happens with end time prophecies, and I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but we'll talk about this later in our course, they come true all the time. And I have some great examples of that to show you. So eisegesis is actually not the best thing to do. I don't want to say you never do it, because people look for their own personal inspiration from the biblical text. But you don't want to have that as your standard. You want to know what's happening in the text and then lead out of that so that you can, in fact, know what the people who were writing it thought they were writing at the time. We have macro interpretations and micro interpretations. One of the things that we can sometimes see in terms of a micro interpretation would be going in to analyze every single word of something and saying, well, this word means this and this word means that. You're sort of missing the forest for the trees when you do that kind of thing. And it's important to know language, and it's important to know words, and there are often key words that come out of the story. But when we're focusing too much on any particular word or any particular passage, we might lose the greater interpretation of what happens. When we're looking at parables, for example, and we have like the parable of the pearl of great price. If we get all hung up on what it means to be a pearl, and are we talking about a small pearl? Are we talking about a big pearl? Are we talking about a symbolic pearl? Are we talking about an actual pearl or a fake pearl? Or what exactly do we mean? Can it mean any kind of gem? Can it mean any kind of anything that's valuable? We get lost in that, and we don't see the larger interpretation, the macro interpretation of what that parable might mean. And especially when we're talking about parables, we will have to be attuned to this. And it's a balancing act. It really is a balancing act along the way. So when we're looking at things, and as I mentioned before in class, one of the things you might try to do is go to Bible Gateway. And let me take this off here, and let me go to our Google here. And you can sort of see I have a lot of tabs open right now. BibleGateway.com. And BibleGateway.com is here. And BibleGateway.com will let you go to any number of translations of the Bible. You can sort of see all of these different translations of the Bible that are here. And when we get into all, for example, you can go to all sorts of different languages that are there. So if you have any particular knowledge of a different language, if you have Spanish or French or German, I know a lot of people in southern Indiana have a German heritage. That's helpful. We have the Vulgate Bible, which is the Latin Bible that most Western Christians used for hundreds and hundreds of years before the King James Version came along. We have sort of the the Norwegian Bible. One of the things that I often will get into is the Icelandic Bible. If you learn anything about me, you'll learn that there's a lot of Iceland in my inspiration that's there. We even have Hawaiian that's there. And if we're looking at different types of ways that passages are translated, we have to look at these different languages sometimes too. But you can see the difference even within the English. So let's go to our sort of standard. The two standards that I typically use for academic study are the New International Version and the New Revised Standard Version. And you can see even with the New Revised Standard, there are a couple of different versions within the version that's there. So let's go to the NIV and let's type in John 3:16, which I did in class. For God so loved the world that he gave his only son, his one and only son, See, I was already defaulting to the King James Version there, where it says he gave his only rather than one and only, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. This is, if you go to football games or basketball games or other things, there are often people who are holding up posters that have John 3:16 on it. Some people have in their like eye markings John 3:16 put in there. There are different ways. But when we look at this just as a verse, we might lose a little bit of the context. Because before that verse, we see that Jesus is talking to someone, and this is part of a conversation. A Pharisee named Nicodemus was a member of the ruling council of the Jewish people at the time. And so this is a conversation, part of a conversation. And you probably have had the experience where someone's taken something you've said in part of a conversation and lifted it up and said, well, you said this, and you're like, well, that's not the whole story. Because look at the next verse, because we look at, for God so loved the world, he gave his one and only son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. But then the next one says, for God did not send his son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. And so, of course, one of the things we see is that it's not meant to be condemning, as this bad news instead of good news. It's like, oh, well, if I don't believe this, then there's no hope for me along the way. But one of the things that we then see right after that is whoever believes in him is not condemned, but whoever does not believe stands condemned already. And it's like, okay, that's getting a little bit back into the other side. So as we go through it, we need to look at the fullness of the story. And of course, one of the things we see is that really the point is the fullness of the text. We can't lift any one word, any one phrase, any one thing out and say, this is all there is, because there's a lot more to it along the way. So going back to our slideshow here, one of the things that we have to see when we're looking at that, I just hope I demonstrated, the resulting interpretation that it says here, is that consistent with the other teachings that are in there? I don't change on me, please, here. So when we're looking at how we understand the text, does what we just learned in this one match what we read around it? And does it match what else we've done in terms of our study? When we're looking at the Bible, a few key concepts are to think about what's called inerrancy and infallibility. Infallibility is the idea that the Bible is trustworthy in all its teaches, in all of its teachings. So essentially what it says is the Bible itself is an idea, is a set of books, is a piece of God's information to the world that is true and trustworthy and will not fail. Our interpretation of it sometimes is fallible, but the text itself is not. That's what that means. And inerrancy means the Bible is trustworthy in all that it asserts. And one of the things that we're looking there is that when we take a look, how can we trust that what was put together 2,000 years ago, if we're looking at the Old Testament, at the Hebrew scriptures 3,000 years ago, or even 4,000 years ago, how can we be sure that what we've got today matches what's happening there? And again, one of the things that sort of inspires me towards this concept is when we look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, the oldest scriptures we had in terms of the oldest actual writings up until the middle of the last century, the sort of 1940s and 50s, tended to be about 1,000 years old. Not too many things were much older than that. And what we had beyond that to our current time up till that point matched. There might have been the occasional typo or other kinds of things that were obviously typos along the way. But they matched pretty well. Then came along this thing called the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the Dead Sea Scrolls took our collection of original texts back and almost a complete 1,000 years more. And the way we looked at those and the way we look at the text today showed that there's an extraordinary trustworthiness. There's an extraordinary tradition of copying and making sure that the text is, in fact, what we need to have. So if you want to follow up on these different ideas, you might go to these websites here. Biblical hermeneutics, that takes us into interpretation and exegesis. Biblical application, how do we interpret things and use things along the way? And what do we mean by the integrity of the Bible? So these are 3 things that are worth reading, but you'll find a lot of things on Google as well in terms of finding out about biblical inerrancy. Not every tradition follows these ideas within the Christian tradition. There are some variations within the different denominations, and it's worth looking up what your particular denomination asserts with regards to these. Some people are Baptist, some people are Methodist, some people are Wesleyan, some people are Lutheran. So you can look at those, and pretty much every major denomination has a statement. Most of them have statements that will change over time based on different kinds of scholarship, but the core message of those statements remains the same. And with very, very, very few exceptions. To be a Christian is to accept the Bible as the primary text and an inerrant and infallible text in many ways. Again, the interpretation of what those words mean can be different for us. So that I hope gives you a little bit more in terms of our statements on how we interpret things. And we'll be talking about this along the way as we look at different things. But I want to go back to our presentation on the textbook as well. Let's get into our little slideshow. Okay, welcome back. You may notice there's a little bit of a glitch there because I was recording and realized it wasn't showing you anything of the new slideshow. So we're starting again here. So part 2, yay, welcome. So I'm gonna try to share my screen here again, and let's see what we can do with regards to our slideshow that's keyed to our text, yay. It says I am sharing the screen. Last time it said I'd stop sharing the screen. So it's important to notice these little markings that are here at the top along the way. Oh, stop. It's moving on its own. I won't cover some things in too much detail, in part because you can read about them, or they're sort of tangential to what's happening along the way. But when we're talking about the New Testament, we have some different things that we are looking at in terms of how it was manufactured, how it was put together. Papyrus we talked about as the origin of paper. When we're talking about the New Testament community, the first Christians, they tended to not be the upper classes who could afford lots of things. They had basic writing materials, and papyrus was the most basic. We still make paper, from which the word comes from papyrus, out of plant fibers for the most part to this day as a standard mechanism. Parchment and vellum was available back then, but that tended to only be for the upper classes. So it would be a couple of 100 years before Christian texts started being recorded on much higher quality stuff. Like this tended to be lambskin, sheepskin. And you think about the Bible, how often sheep are mentioned in the Hebrew scriptures as well as the New Testament scriptures along the way. So it would take a very long time to manufacture these kinds of things. So it was pretty rare. It was pretty rare. Papyrus was what you would use typically to send a letter. And if you think about the New Testament, how many of those books are letters of Paul or letters of Peter or letters of John? They also, though, tended to disintegrate more. They rotted in humid weather. So within the land of Israel, especially central and northern Israel today, old Palestine, old Syrio-Palestine, because it was not the same kind of political structure as it has today, not the same kinds of political divisions. That tended to be places where over time papyrus would fall apart, just like if you left paper out outdoors, and or even in a house or a building that wasn't air conditioned and heated. Over time, the paper gets brittle and things begin to fall apart. Parchment and vellum tend to last a lot longer, but since most of the early texts tended to be on papyrus, we don't have a lot that's there. The Dead Sea Scrolls and various similar things survived in part because most of the scrolls were written on a more parchment kind of basis, but also because they were buried in caves that were far, far away from any kind of dampness and things that it survived in Egypt, for example. If they were away from the Nile, they tended to be pretty dry as well. So one of the things that we see is that there are different ways of writing. One of the things I invite you to look at, I didn't mention this in class, look at this text here. This is Greek. Notice there are no divisions between the words. Notice there are no punctuation marks. Notice it's all capital letters. One of the things that happened is most people were not able to read silently. You had to read it out loud, and as you read it out loud, you would begin to figure out where the words were. Think about the text, I am now here, or I am nowhere. If you don't put any divisions in the words that are there, I am now here, I am nowhere, how do you know where to put the divisions between those things along the way? That's one of the things that can sometimes trip us up. But there's an economic motivation to this. When you don't have divisions between the words, you can fit more words on a page. And paper, even papyrus, was a very rare commodity back then. So we tend to need lectors. We tend to need people who not only know how to read, but know how to read out loud and need to know how to make the word divisions along the way. We covered some of this in class with regards to what is in the New Testament. We have the Gospels. Almost half of the writing that's in there is the Gospel, but those are only 4 books, so it's not half the books, it's half the actual writing, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Then we have the Acts of the Apostles, which is part 2 to the book of Luke, and Luke wrote both of those. The epistles are the letters. We have letters from various people, including most frequently from Paul, but also Peter and John and others, and a couple of letters that are probably anonymous. And then we have the Revelation to John, and this is sort of the division that's there. It's disappearing. It's disappearing there. Let's see, can we get it? Actually, no. I don't know. Okay, maybe you can actually see this here. Let me see if I can get the lighting a little bit better. No, that's too bright. It's hard to see in this camera kind of thing. Let me see if I stop sharing for a moment, can we see it any better? No, this is weird. This is weird. So I'm sorry about that. This is actually a book called. Let's see. Do I have a light over here that will help? The Complete Gospels, you can sort of see that now, I think, the Complete Gospels, if I aim it away from the light. Now I look like I'm sunburned. But this book, The Complete Gospels, is compiled by a guy named Robert J. Miller. He is someone who works for with different projects, including a lot with the Dead Sea Scrolls. But this includes fragments and bits and pieces of a lot of different books that were floating around the ancient world that purported to be Gospels. And it includes the narrative Gospels, which are the ones we have in our Bible, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as well as a 5th one called the Signs Gospel. And then there are sayings Gospels, there are infancy Gospels, there are fragmentary Gospels, and then there are some orphan sayings and stories, which means we don't know really where they've come from. Let me turn this off so I don't look quite so sort of weird there. It's hard to get the lighting right for Zoom. But the Complete Gospels goes into some of the world around the New Testament. So I wanted to share that with you. I'm sorry that Zoom seems to be having an issue with sharing it to you. I also wanted to share this book, which sort of, because of the coloration of the cover, shows up a little bit better. This is called the Dead Sea Scrolls Bible. And what they've done is they've taken the Bible, which for the Dead Sea Scrolls pretty much is the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, and taken what is in the Dead Sea Scrolls and translated it as oh, we're disappearing here, disappearing book, translated it in the same way, in the same order as the Hebrew scriptures, so that we can sort of see a comparison of what is in there with regard to the text that we have. And we talked a little bit about integrity of the text in our other slideshow presentation, so that's worth seeing there. Let me go back to our sharing of the screen here, which is our New Testament writings that are there. One of the ways that we can separate things out when we're talking about Gospels are biography. Biography is sometimes written to a point. We talked a little bit about George Washington, for example. People who were writing about George Washington were often writing to elevate him, to make him to be an almost mythical figure that Americans could focus on as the father of the country and the father of the nation. When John F. Kennedy was assassinated, his widow, Jackie Kennedy, intentionally hired an author to write a book about his life, intending to position him in a progressive and positive way, to get away from the politics of the time and to get into larger themes that might make his legacy a little more sustainable. And in fact, that's what happened. We see that happening again and again when we see different kinds of political figures who fall from grace, but then later are rehabilitated because someone wrote a biography about them, or people who were held in high esteem and then someone writes a tell-all biography of them, and their image gets tarnished a little bit. When we're talking about ancient biography, we're talking about writing with a purpose. And when we're talking about ancient history, which is what the book of Acts is, it's not really a biography, except it's a biography of the early church. It's also written with a purpose. Certainly all the letters and sermons are written with purposes, and the apocalyptic literature, this is what's happening at the end time, they're all written with a purpose in mind. So these are not neutral writings. That's one of the key things to keep in mind. A lot of the things were in fact oral texts, as we mentioned before. Even the things that were letters were meant to be read out loud. They didn't have photocopiers or mimeograph machines or other kinds of things back then. They would send one letter to the whole church and it would be read out to everyone because they didn't have the time or the resources or the technology to disseminate it in any other way. And then frequently they would send that letter on to another church and then to another church, and it would just be one letter that would be read over and over and over again. We've lost, in fact, some letters that we know were sent back then because there was only one copy or very few copies, and none of them survived to our time. So when we're looking at those things, we know that they tend to be fairly brief. When we're looking at the figure of Jesus himself, as I mentioned before, we don't tend to take the New Testament as being the sort of the only history that there is, because as we mentioned before, it's written for a purpose. New Testament witnesses are not unhistorical, as we say, but they certainly are biased. So one of the things that helps sustain the idea that Jesus was a real person is the fact that there are outside evidences that point to the life of Jesus as well. Some of these are Josephus, who I mentioned before. He was someone who was part of the Jewish community. He was someone who was also part of, we might consider to be a little bit of a collaborator with the Romans. And then, of course, we have Tacitus or Tacitus, you can pronounce it either way, and he wrote a great history of Rome at the time, and he mentions Jesus, he mentions the crucifixion by Pilate, he mentions the word Christian, which is what followers of Jesus were called after a certain period of time in the city of Antioch. They were not originally called Christians. And we can see, as we'll see throughout the course, there are different names that come up before then. So we see a couple of different references outside of the text. So people who say, oh, well, you can't just trust the Bible because, of course, it would say, there are, in fact, outside references. When we get inside, we see that there are different images of Jesus, and we talked about this in our class. Suffering servant, the Son of Man, the Son of God, the Messiah, the completer of faith, with the wisdom of God. We have all of these different images that will pop up as we're reading through the different texts. So keep in mind that there's not just one idea of Jesus, and that should not come as a surprise, because most of us have different identities. For some people, I'm a New Testament professor. For some people, if you go to Ivy Tech, I'm the astronomy professor. If you go back 10 years, I was a history professor and an economics professor. I'm also a student. I am taking classes for another degree right now. I am also a chaplain. I am also a son. I am also a brother. I am also a cousin. So I have all of these different identities. I'm also a music lover. I'm also a fan of travel. I'm also, weirdly to most of my friends, someone who has great affection for the country of Iceland. I mean, who would pick Iceland? Well, here I am. And I'm known in Iceland as the guy who always wears hats, and I wear such a weird hat that everyone tends to know. It's a very small country. They all know me there. That's one of the things that we should keep in mind with regard to our own life. And different people who wrote about me might hold up different things. As you might try this as an example for yourself sometime, say go on Facebook or something like that and post up a question to all of your friends and family. When you think of me, what do you think of? And just have them say, give one word or one phrase. And I'll bet you'll come up with a lot of different kinds of things. When we think about Jesus, the different kinds of things that come forward to us in the Gospels, including many of these other Gospels that didn't make the final cut to the Bible. He was Jewish. He was someone who adhered to the law of Judaism. We sometimes forget that. He was controversial, however, and he didn't always seem to play nice with others. And I'm thinking here in particular of the turning over the tables in the temple and other kinds of things like that. He was recognized as a teacher. You'll see the word rabbi he's referred to as rabbi in a number of passages. That means teacher. He was able to read. We see at different times where he picks up and reads. There is a scholar or two who debate whether or not he really could read, but most will tend to think he could, largely because that was pretty common back then, that people would have basic literacy skills. He knew the law well enough that he probably read quite a bit more than the average person. He was multilingual. That's not a surprise back then too. His basic language at home would have been Aramaic to read the scriptures. He would have read Hebrew or Greek to speak to the general population. Outside of his community, he probably would have spoken Greek. He might have known a little bit of Latin as well with regards to the Romans that are there. So when we're looking at the witnesses of the Gospels, we also have what we call the Passion story. He was crucified by Pilate. He was buried. He was resurrected. He appeared to the disciples and others, and he sent the Holy Spirit down. These are parts of the articles of faith of most Christians along the way. He was a miracle worker. It's important to understand he's not the only miracle worker in the Bible or in history. There are many who have worked miracles, and one of the things that Jesus promised to his followers is that they would also be able to work miracles. And in fact, there are stories of the disciples after Jesus left the scene of continuing to work miracles. And there have been different Christian traditions that have carried on the idea that miracles continue to happen. Usually miracles are life-altering in one way or another. So when we're looking at the sort of spiritual side of our texts, we need to not have what's called the willing suspension of disbelief that we sometimes do when we're watching movies and television, but we have to have a faith that the people who are reporting what they saw and what they encountered are in fact reliable witnesses. When we talk about the time of Jesus, when we talk about the area in which Jesus was living, we have a history of the people of Israel, pretty much from the time of David, the monarchy, and to shortly thereafter when Israel in the north and Judea in the south separate, of being under someone's thumb. The Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, all of these people sort of successively take over the territory until most of the leaders are carted away, and then they come back. And while they're there, they're still under the Greeks or under the Romans. So this is not a place that is on its own. It's usually reacting against some outside force. I talked about several of the kings that we had in ancient Israel during the time immediately before and to the time of Jesus and a little bit beyond. Antipater is one of the ones who established a relationship with the Romans so that it remained a kingdom within the empire. Herod the Great, was a friend of the Romans. You didn't stay king if you weren't for very long. He's best known as the person who tried to kill the infant Jesus. Then we have several others who were in charge at the time, including these Agrippas. This is Herod Agrippa. And one of the things that we know about some of these characters comes from outside sources as well. Tacitus and another Roman historian named Suetonius, for example, talk about these figures along the way. One of the interesting things about Herod Agrippa is that he also thought of himself as a Messiah. And his idea of the Messiah was someone who would drive out the Romans. And as he was trying to exalt himself as the new Messiah who would drive out the Romans, he was actually struck down in a rather dramatic way that rather looked like it was a divine judgment. He was all ready to announce the revolution has come and he's the Messiah, and all of a sudden he began having physical attacks and died almost in a sort of way of being eaten by worms. I mean, it's really weird. So it is quite something as we look back there. When we're looking at the culture, this is mostly Greek culture. When we think about Roman culture really lifted the Greek culture out and said, yeah, this is pretty good, we're going to keep it. They had buildings that are very similar to our Capitol buildings and courthouse buildings and other kinds of things. We often have theaters that are designed in the same way. The idea of going to the theater, of gathering in those kinds of situations, or gathering together in stadiums. A stadium is a Latin word, for example, if you have at the end, which also comes from the Greek, which we have had games, and we still celebrate different kinds of games, the Super Bowl, for example, or the Final Four, or other kinds of things. We gather by the thousands to do this. Greek was the language that everyone spoke. If you were from Egypt or Syria or Asia Minor, which is Turkey today, or even from Rome, you would have spoken Greek as your primary second language. And the values that come from that are sort of Greek philosophy and rationality and reason and other kinds of pluralism. There was actually a respect for different kinds of peoples and ideas, but only to an extent that could be pushed along the way. Many of the core values we talked about as we were looking at those, honor and shame. If you're honored, you get to sit higher at the table. If you're shamed, you might be lesser. We all know families that limit people's exposure. It's like you only see them at weddings and funerals, or there might be that person who is sort of like, oh, well, that's the black sheep of the family. There are some cultures to this day, I think I mentioned the Amish people in our class, where you have communal shunning because someone's done something wrong. And we might not from the outside see that they've done something wrong along the way. It's like, well, that person married outside the faith, so we're going to shame them. We're going to shun them along the way. We don't tend to use the word shame as much, but it's a very similar kind of concept. Honor, on the other hand, if we have a celebrity in the family, if we have a politician in the family, oh, I'm related to the mayor, I'm related to the governor, I'm related to the person who starred in that show on that network, kinds of things. We can get honor from that along the way. This was a very patriarchal society. Men were in charge outside of the house. And one of the things that we sometimes forget, though, is that women tended to be more dominant inside the house. So we did have quite a structure. It is interesting that one of the things that we see with regards to Jesus' ministry at the time is that as he was talking to the people who followed him, he would pay as much attention to the women as he would to the men. And when we think about figures such as Mary Magdalene, she's often referred to in medieval times as apostoli apostolorum, which is the Latin construction for the apostle to the apostles, because she was the first one to see the risen Jesus and the first one to proclaim to the other apostles that she had seen the risen Jesus. And so we see that Jesus didn't enforce the patriarchy. That might have been one of the points of tension with the other Jewish people at the time. Back then, who you were depended not just on you as an individual, especially here in the United States. In the history of America, we have this sort of idea of rugged individualism. You sort of set out to make your way on your own. That was not something that happened back then. You were part of a family, you were part of a community, you were part of a group. There was a television show called I, Claudius, and it was based on the emperors of Rome. And there were all sorts of almost like soap opera kinds of things happening. And the commentator around the show, it would be introduced by a guy named Alistair Cook. And he said, you have all of these fights and all of this infighting and all of these conflicts. And it's like, why didn't people just get up and move somewhere else? And he said that the key reason was you didn't do that back then. That's a modern notion. The idea that you would move out of your family home and go somewhere else and do something else, that just didn't happen. You were part of your family, you were part of your community, you were part of your synagogue at this time, and you typically did what happened in your family. And we still have some remnants of that today, especially in the aristocracy. It's sort of like the people in the British royal family. If you're born into that, that's what you do. You don't do too much else apart from that. You might have the occasional outside dalliances, but I mean, think of it. You may have noticed in the newspaper when Prince Harry decided he didn't want to be a prince anymore and didn't want to be royal anymore, and all of the fuss that got kicked up over simply saying, I want to move somewhere else and do something else. This just isn't done. That wasn't done back then either. Religion was part of things. There was no idea of separation of church and state. And typically, whatever religion you were born into was what you were. You didn't tend to change religion. So the idea that you were converting away from one thing to another was unheard of. And I have this sort of interesting experience. When Afghanistan was being remolded after the 9/11 attacks, one of the things that happened was they had a new constitution, and in that constitution it promised freedom of religion. Well, here in the United States, we also have in our constitution freedom of religion. Well, a few years after that, there was a man who was a Muslim put on trial because he had converted to Christianity. In particular, he had converted to Catholicism. And he was being put on trial, and he was going to be sentenced to death for converting to Christianity. And everyone in the United States, everyone in the West is like, hang on, your constitution says freedom of religion. And the judge explained, he said, we have freedom of religion, but not freedom to convert. You're free to be Christian, you're free to be Jewish, you're free to be Catholic, you're free to be Lutheran, you're free to be Muslim, but you're not free to change from one to the other. And in particular, in Afghanistan, from Islam to something else. that didn't sound like what we thought freedom of religion would be in the West, but that's how they were interpreting it there. Now, eventually, the Vatican and Italian authorities negotiated somehow and got him out of the country, and he survived. But it was interesting that that idea, our modern ideas, even in modern times, of how religion and politics are involved, is different from what was happening in the ancient world. Christianity was part of Judaism when it was starting, and that's how it regarded itself. But as Gentiles became part of the structure, it began to take on new aspects. And when that became a new religion, that began to cause some conflicts along the way. So those are things to keep in mind as we're looking at the way we look at the ancient world. One thing I also want to highlight here, let me see if I can find it on my page. You have a report to write, and let me see if I can share this screen here. Let's see. There you have look at the cultural and geographical settings of the New Testament. So basically what you can do is look at where it is, what cities are there, what peoples are there, what language they speak, what politics they have, what religion they have, what kings they had, what structure they had, where the people of Israel were under other authorities, those different kinds of things. Think about those things, because that's the context of the New Testament. The Roman authority, the Greek language, the Middle Eastern structure. Israel sits between. Over here, we've got Babylon and old Assyria and Persia, the Parthians at the time. And then down here, over in this area, we have the Egyptians. It was a crossroads. So people would go from one to the other, back and forth. So they constantly had people who are going through and trading. So that was part of the context as well. So as you write this, think about those things along the way. You'll also want to do your Unit 1 discussion posting. And this talks specifically about language and culture. So think about what it means to be speaking a particular language. And you might think about this when you're thinking about language and culture. Think about Rome. They mostly spoke Latin in Rome, but everyone there also spoke Greek as their second language. What happens when the second language is Greek, but the first language is Hebrew or Aramaic or something like that? So think about people today whose first language might be German, might be Spanish, might be French. On our continent, we have Spanish-speaking people to the south and French-speaking people to the north. We often forget about the French-speaking people in Quebec in Canada. But in North America, we have three primary foreign languages, or three primary languages that are foreign to each other. The people in Quebec speak French as a first language, so English is foreign, their second language. The people in Mexico speak Spanish, so English is their second language. Most people in the United States speak English, so Spanish and French would be their second and third language. Except here in the United States, we've also been the immigration melting pot. So as I mentioned before, here in Southern Indiana, we have a lot of people who still have grandparents whose first language was German, especially if you go to Jasper and that area around there. Lots of German-speaking people, lots of German influences that are still there. And you go to different parts of the country and you find enclaves of people who speak Italian or speak Chinese or speak Irish. There are often more Irish speakers in the United States than there are in Ireland, for example. Go to Chicago and there are a lot of people whose first language is Polish. Chicago is often called the second largest Polish city in the world after Warsaw, because there are so many people who speak it there. If you go to various places in the Dakotas and Minnesota and a few places in Canada, you'll find as many people speaking Icelandic there. Yeah, see, I have to get Iceland in there somewhere. As you will find in Iceland as well, because when people immigrated, that's where they came. And you'll see often different place names reflect the culture as well. So language and culture influence. Think about how that played out in the New Testament area as well. So just one thing to keep in mind, there are often not absolutely wrong answers here. There are better answers and worse answers, but there aren't any wrong answers because we can draw out different kinds of things. So I hope you'll take the opportunity to explore, and don't be afraid to voice opinions, and don't be afraid to express some ideas that you may not be sure of yourself. I'm not expecting you to know everything there is all at once. So these are the things you have: your discussion, and you have your unit report. And don't forget also that you have the quiz that's up there. I know we're sort of dealing with different kinds of things in our life, well, with the coronavirus and various other things that can get in the way. So try to maintain a schedule, try to maintain working to deadlines. But if it sort of goes here and there a little bit, that's fine. I probably will be grading the things from week 1 nearer the end of week 2. So if you don't get everything up by Tuesday night, that's fine. But again, one of the things that I really don't want, and your grade may suffer a little bit if you do this, do not wait until week 5 and then try to throw everything up in week 5. So that's not really going to work. In large part because, especially with the discussion, you need to interact back and forth with each other, and by then everyone's gone. So do your best. Don't stress over it. I want to repeat that. This is a course where we're looking at ideas and looking at concepts and looking at things sometimes in new ways. When I taught this class once before, that was one of the things I kept hearing is, oh, this is all so new. That's fine. That's what education is, what it's supposed to be, our exposure to new things. And one of the things I value about teaching this class and having this class with you is that you'll bring ideas perhaps that I hadn't thought of before because you're a unique individual. And I look forward to that as well. So thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in class.